Hi, my name is Abdur-Rahman. I've been a program evaluator, data analyst, and internal consultant on program design in nonprofits and education research since 2013. And today we're going to look at some CDC data from their household pulse survey, and specifically looking at some of the data on long COVID. Before getting too ahead of ourselves, it's probably good just to set some baseline context for why this is of increasing interest. So this is pulse survey from the most recent cycle this spring. And I would just pay attention to the map here because it's more comprehensible. And so here, the darker blue have higher rates of adults who have previously had COVID-19 and report, having ever had symptoms of long COVID, so that symptoms lasting 3 months or longer. Some of these states in the dark blue go all the way up to 41%, right? Wyoming being at the top. And if you do look over on the side here, you can see these sorted in descending order. The error bar is what's over here, right? Sort of plus or minus 5%. So these dark blue states, of which there are not a few, right? Let's ballpark maybe 12, 15 or so states, right? So those are upwards of 35%. The US as a national aggregate is at 30%, right? So all of these states from Rhode Island up, and that's actually including this lighter blue, the periwinkle. So the periwinkle and the dark blue are all above the US average, basically. And then to get below that, you go into these lighter shades of blue. And then there's 3 states that are in the lower range. The lower range here being up to 25%. So just to sort of let that soak in. I just moved from New Mexico to Missouri. Right, so then both of these are above the national average. What's interesting and challenging about this is that this is with symptoms lasting, 3 months or longer. It doesn't get into the length or the severity. The more severe cases do have a lower percentage, but this is still pretty massive, right? Because when we're looking at the number of people who's represented, um, that's 36 million people uh, overall, right? And that's sort of the point where we're going to jump off and looking at this at a little bit more of a disaggregated level. Let's start here. So the CDC site does a household pulse survey. They usually do a few each year, and they cover a variety of different metrics. You can find this just by searching for like CDC long COVID household pulse. And specifically under these topics, you'll see pages for different areas. They also have survey questions on food security, housing, economics, things like that. And so there's raw data that we can do a little bit more with, but let's just start with sort of the basics. This is a chart that I have seen referenced in literally one article about why long COVID matters for queer and trans communities. And it's useful, but it's a little, it's very number heavy. So I know that a lot of folks can get easily stressed out by things like this. But you can see by state, by disability status, by education, etc. The cool thing about this is, one, you can access the raw data just down below, but also they have interactive tools where you can make your own, which is what I started doing this morning. So this is just looking at adults who ever experienced long COVID, out of people who have ever had COVID-19. which is a large chunk of the country. These are all percentages, right? As percentage of adults who ever had long COVID. And right now, this is disaggregated by race. And then the label series here, the blue are the folks who ever experienced long COVID, and then orange were folks who currently were experiencing symptoms of long COVID at the time of taking that survey. So obviously, this is from 2022 on. And so naturally, I was interested in looking at this over time. But in general, you can see, right, like the range goes all the way up to 37% of multiracial or other race communities. And note that other races includes anybody who doesn't consider themselves like Latinx, Black, White, or Asian, right? So these surveys tend to be a little bit coarse with racial and ethnic data. And so that's just something to keep in mind. When we're looking at this over time, this is the same thing, but we've taken out the ethnicity data, at least in the series. Again, it's down below in the tables, but hard to read, so we're not going to worry about that. So you can see there has been sort of like a little bit of a decline, right? So it sort of started out in this 37% range in the 2022 surveys. But even here, right, it's at 29%. My apologies, the colors just switched on us. So maybe I'll change that for, I haven't published these yet. So anyway, but this is several years, right, into COVID-19 kind of as a phenomenon. And so more people have had COVID, obviously, over time. But that hasn't really dropped the ratio that much. When we're looking at people who report currently experiencing symptoms, though, we actually notice that that almost sort of flattens out over time. And so that's something to think about as well. The last thing that I want to share in this video is around long COVID and ability and disability. And this is a slippery slope because long COVID itself can lead one to sort of shift from being an able bodied person to being a disabled person. So that's maybe a topic for another video to get into national trends in disability and things like that. But for today, we're just going to look at some of the differences of grouping and how they experience things. And for most of this, the metrics are actually pre-made on the CDC site, so you don't even have to make your own stuff. Okay, so so here we have just the past couple of months of data from the CDC Household Pulse Survey, May, April, March, February. These are the end dates of the surveys. The bars are different racial ethnic groups. They're listed over here. The median here is at 10.3%. That's the median for this whole time period. And so obviously some groups are about half that, some groups are over that, but overall, we're hovering around 10%. Okay, that's fine. That's great. So this is now just looking at the most recent survey. And you can get to this. We started here before, right, the pulse survey topics. So you can go down to functioning and disability. And in this chart here, this one's a little bit easier because it has bar charts sort of by default. You can select different indicators here. So first we're starting with what we'd looked at before, folks who ever experienced long COVID as a percent of adults who had COVID. We can actually, just for sake of comparison, look at this again by race and ethnicity. So this is where we now have series that layer in folks who have a disability versus folks who do not have a disability. It doesn't tell us how large those groups are, right? This is just categorical differences. And so what is pretty clear, aside from this multi-race, other race group, all of these other groups, there's pretty significant differences between the experience of having long COVID out of folks who had COVID, right? They're generally about double. So for Black folks, 47% versus 26%, just a little under double. The white cohort, 49% versus 27%. So again, given again that sort of confidence interval, um, you're seeing just about double rates for some of these groups. And then the aggregate here, you can see 48 versus 28. So 20% difference, right? Pretty notable. What you can also see here is, so we can look at current experiences of long COVID. And again, I'm looking at groups who've ever had COVID just because it's so common and because generally we've, as a nation, by policy, dropped any sort of effort to keep people from getting COVID. And so the policy is basically, we're going to assume that you will have COVID, right? So that's sort of the policy baseline. So for folks currently experiencing long COVID, right, we're seeing some of these lower numbers. But when we're looking just at these months, still, right, not in sort of the 10% range for the group with disability. We're seeing this, again, sort of double, right? So the dark blue here, we're seeing 10% for Latinx, 6% for Asian, 7% for Black, 8% for white, and then 12, that higher percentage in the other group. Again, over here, you can just do the comparison of the 8.6 versus the 21, which is actually closer to 3 times a difference. The thing about this, in terms of it being a disabling condition, right, is we can look at folks who actually have activity limitations. And here I'm going to change from race and ethnicity to something more general, just because we lose a lot of data here. So let's look at this by age group. All right, so for folks who have disabilities in, let's say, the 18 to 44%, right, 89% of folks with disability are experiencing activity limitation. Which for me is saying, basically, if you have a disability and you get like long COVID, it's going to be more disabling, right? You're going to have more of an activity limitation. They also break this down into significant activity limitation. What I don't want to skip over, though, is that all of these folks who don't have a disability, or at least identifying that for the purpose of the survey, are still in the 75 to 80% range, right? In some senses, a lot of the symptom listing of long COVID are essentially things that would be considered disabling, right? Such as loss of mobility or stamina, or, There's also then significant activity limitations, and I'll look up at the documentation and maybe post the link to that of like how they distinguish those two. But again, you can see that while this group was in the 89%, I'm sorry, it switched to sort. The 18 to 44 group was in the 89% range in the previous visual for any level of activity limitation. Basically, half of that group is severely affected. All right. For the severe activity or significant activity limitations, that goes down to 18%. So it's still a fifth of that cohort, right? And so obviously when we start, multiplying out, right, this percentage times this percentage, we do get these very small groups, but the likelihood itself is not remote, right? For people who have ever had long COVID, it is not unlikely, right, when we were looking at just the national data overall, So when we are looking at this map of the country, right, of the recent, right, by state percentage of people who'd ever had long COVID previously, we're getting to the place, and this is where there are some articles that are noting, we're kind of just letting a disabling condition uh, sweep across the nation, of it becoming assumed that at some point in time people will become either temporarily or permanently disabled by long COVID. Um, that's what getting towards a 50% mark is going, right? Like Wyoming's at 41%. We can do some more data analysis, and again, maybe that'll be a future video to look at some of those separations, right? Of like what's the level of activity limitation, etc. Um, but overall, it's not that it's a 10% likelihood, right? It in general across the country, 30% of people who've ever had COVID end up having long COVID. Um, that's a 1 in 3 shot, right? So just a little bit of recontextualization of what's being talked about and why this might be more of an important area for policy considerations really across domains. So thanks for watching this video. If you made it this far, if you have questions or comments or data sets that you think would be fun for me to look at and info dump on, let me know. And yeah, otherwise I'll probably um, continue some of the themes that came up with the long COVID question around rates of disability, and is that increasing? Is it increasing in a way that seems disproportionate to population size? I don't know. Hopefully not. It's not like I'm wanting bad things for people. But anyway, thanks so much. Check you later.